So I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that I'm coming to you all from today, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people in Canberra and the surrounding regions where I have the great privilege to live, work and play and raise my child, who's in the background in case we get interrupted. And I'd like to acknowledge elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to acknowledge country from where you're all dialing in from today, and anyone who's watching this recording, acknowledging that the traditional custodians of this country have cared for it since time immemorial in much better ways than most of the people who many of us are descended from or connected to today. So with that acknowledgement and being very aware of the centrality of fire for First Nations people and in particular the 2019-20 wildfires and how devastating they have been to First Nations people, I'd like to acknowledge any First Nations people who are watching or joining us today. Thank you so much, John, for agreeing to come and talk to us about what I think you and we collectively have learnt since the fires started almost 2 years ago, almost 3 years ago now in 2019. We were barely out of winter when people like Paul and others in Queensland started experiencing fires of a really devastating nature in their regions. And I know that most of us have lived through that experience and have been working very hard since those fires to recover our landscapes and our biodiversity and understand what's happened. So really looking forward to seeing what you have learnt through the book, through the synthesis work that you have led in that book, and that many of us here contributed to in various chapters of that book, but also many others as well from state government and NGOs and federal government and First Nations groups and many others, and research of course as well. So for those of you who don't know John, I'd like to introduce John Woinarski. John is an esteemed ecologist who's worked in many roles, including as the Deputy Chair of the Minister's Wildlife and Threatened Species Bushfire Recovery Expert Panel. I think I got that in the right order. It's been a while since I've had to say that. And also was Deputy Director of the Nest Threatened Species Recovery Hub, which took on a major proportion of the research effort in the wake of the 2019-20 wildfires. So John has a lot of knowledge in this space, did a lot of the emergency response research assessments and many other things, and has since compiled this book, lead edited this book that has drawn together lessons and hopefully can help prepare us for the future. So over to you, John.
Thank you, Rachel. That's very gracious of you. I'm speaking from a Wiradjuri country where it's uncommonly and uncomfortably bleak winter at the moment. I'm used to Darwin weather, and it's a bit of a fall coming back to Melbourne. I'm also somewhat technically incompetent, so I'm hoping Rachel will be able to run the PowerPoint for me. Thank you, Rachel. So a couple of points, as Rachel pointed out, what I'm talking about largely comes from a book that I was one of the editors of, and it seems about half the people on this audience were also contributors to, so thank you very much for all of those. A couple of comments initially. It seems a bit slightly odd still to be talking about the wildfires of 2019-20 when we've had a series of catastrophic events, particularly flooding in Eastern Australia since then. And I think much of what I want to say is relevant to much of the emergency response to all natural disasters anyway. So, and we do have to think of how we're going to plan for the future. So I don't think the material is stale in any manner. So I think it's still worth talking about. Also, I note here with the asterisk at the bottom that what I'm talking about was also helped by the work of Rachel, Libby Rumpf and Sarah Legg in particular. And I think Libby's addressed you, and part of what I'm wanting to say will probably overlap with what Libby has talked to you about before, but I'll put a different spin on it. Also, before I proceed further, I'm using a lot of photographs from this book, and I haven't acknowledged the photographers individually, but I appreciate very much all their contributions. Thanks, Rachel. So we figured that it was a worthwhile exercise because the 2019-20 fires were so exceptional and important and something of a landmark in Australian conservation. that it was worth trying to document as much as we could about the event, the responses that were made, the impacts, and what it means for our future. So we, Libby Rump, Sarah Legg, Stephen Van Leeuwen, Brendan Wintle, and I edited this book, and there were about 200 contributors. And for those who are eagerly waiting to come out, we'll be getting proofs, I think, in about a month, and we'll be forwarding those to you. And the book should be published in time for Christmas, hopefully. So something to give your small children for Christmas would be ideal. So if next slide, please, Rachel. So today I'm mostly talking about impacts and the lessons and recommendations. So I won't go into the detail for a whole lot of things that are in the book. So yeah, next. So I'll start with talking about the impacts, and then the rest of the talk, I'll talk about lessons that we've learned and things which worked and things which didn't work. And feel free to interrupt at any stage. I'm not very formal in this presentation. So part of the story with the impacts of these 2019-20 fires is that we haven't actually realised all of the impacts that followed from the fires or were caused by the fires. We're still discovering some of the impacts, and many of the others we still just don't know exactly how serious they were. The fires were exceptional compared to all previous fires in recorded Australian history, in that especially they left very few unburnt patches within the landscape. And those unburnt patches are typically really important as source areas and refuge areas from which populations of fire-affected species subsequently recolonise the burnt landscape. In much of the area that was affected by the 2019-20 fires, there simply weren't those unburnt patches in the landscape. And that photo on the right was Kangaroo Island, and that was probably the most extreme case of leaving very little refuge. It's been challenging to figure out exactly what proportion of fire-affected plants and animals were actually killed by the fires. And that's largely because there was very little monitoring work that was undertaken before the fire. So we didn't really have pre-fire population data for many of the species that we presume were severely fire affected. And that's a pervasive problem sort of in Australian ecology generally, that our monitoring programs for biodiversity are pretty poor. And while we will see some recovery and have seen some recovery from the fires to date, the future of that recovery is highly contingent on what happens in the future. So things might be going okay. The trend for many of these fire-affected species may be recovering currently, but if there's another fire in the near future, then the losses will compound and be more serious than initially. And just one point I should have raised before was that I'm talking about the biodiversity conservation impacts of these fires rather than the economic, social, health, and other factors as well. And I appreciate that you all will be dealing with or have dealt with more than simply the nature of the fires, the impacts also on communities and the like. Thanks, Rachel. So it wasn't all bad. You know, there were some unexpectedly high rates of survival for some animals in these fires. We have seen subsequent to the fires recolonisation of some of the burnt areas by some animals and by some plants. Botanists who had worried about some species disappearing from the landscape prior to the fires happily were surprised, but in a few cases, not many, by those plant species reappearing in areas that they hadn't been seen in for a long time. So the fires helped regenerate or cause the germination of some of these species, which were formerly very rare. And of course, the landscape itself is greening up through epicormic growth and rapid revegetation in many areas. So it looks far less gloomy than it used to be. And, you know, that green does actually tinge our emotions and give us some heart as well. Thanks, Rachel. Much of the response to the public response to the wildfires was catalysed by images such as the one on the left there of the koala. And that had a sort of global significance and reach. So it attracted huge public support and willingness to contribute and desire to get things done. And in many cases, some of the fire injured animals were happily rescued and returned to the bush. However, next, thanks, Rachel. The major losses were not really of those iconic high-profile species. And so that while much of the focus was on koalas, kangaroos, and the like, that tended to obscure impacts which were much more profound and on species which had far less public appeal and public awareness. So we reckon there's probably about 5,000 plant and animal species that were far more affected than the koala, yet the koala monopolised much of the public response. I haven't got it in for koalas. You know, it's clearly that they did need some help, and koala conservation does help other things as well. But we shouldn't overlook the fact that many other species were affected. So those beautiful pie charts, this is from Sarah Legg, those beautiful pie charts on the right of, or on my right, I suppose they're on your right as well. The number of species in different taxonomic groups that had at least 1% of their known distribution burnt by these 2019-20 fires. And the very dark pie slices are species, the number of species that their entire known distribution was burnt by these fires. So we know that at least 20 plant species, more than 100 fungi species, and nearly 400 invertebrates had all of their known distributions burnt by the fires. So there's a possibility that all of those species may have been wiped out by the fires, or they may have liked fires and not responded, or populations may have been affected to somewhere between 0 and 100%. In many of the cases, these species that were totally burnt by the fires were really poorly known. So we really don't know whether the distributions, as in our databases, are valid or not, or are comprehensive or not. So these are species that we should have some profound concerns about, and we do need to prioritise those species for further work, further survey and study. About nearly 20% of Australia's threatened species were affected by these fires, which is a really profound or substantial amount. No other single event has had such a drastic and sudden impact on Australia's threatened species, or Australian biodiversity generally, since European colonisation. And no wildfire in our recorded history has had such an impact on the environment. Next, thanks. We do know of one unarguable extinction that was caused by these fires, and that was for the plant louse, which is the very small white blob. And that's part of the problem here, that the species is entirely uncharismatic. So it was restricted to, it was a host species specific specialist. It occurred only on one plant species in southwestern Australia. And that plant had only occurred because of a series of fires in the past. There were only 6 of the plant species that were mature that this plant louse occurred in, and all of those 6 plants were destroyed by the fires in 2019-20, and subsequent surveys have failed to record that plant louse. So that's one unequivocal case of extinction due to these fires. And of course, it didn't get much public airing or conservation concern, simply because it was such an unattractive, low profile, uncharismatic species. And there's a lesson there that, you know, if we really do care about biodiversity, then we should be prepared to bat for the, that's a terrible analogy, we should be prepared to fight for even the most uncharismatic species, because they're all part of the wonder of nature. And possibly, last I heard, the Yami galaxis, a small fish from southeastern, from East Gippsland, was down to only 1 individual as well. I'm not sure whether that's wild or not. But these are the 2 cases where extinction has been proven or is most likely known to have occurred. I suspect the actual number of extinctions due to these fires is substantially higher, and probably around a couple of 100 species. Next, thanks. The fires themselves had their own direct and individual impacts, but they also caused substantial greater impacts through the compounding influence of other factors such as pests, weeds, disease and the like. And this picture on the right is of myrtle rust, which was catalyzed by the fires to spread, and largely because the emergent shoots post-fire, the green growth, the epicormics and the like, were really ideal foliage for myrtle rust. So those factors have exaggerated and amplified the impacts of the fire itself. Next. Not all is terribly bad with these interacting factors. So for example, we had monitoring data from Kangaroo Island before the fires, and we revisited those sites after the fires, and we found that the fires had caused, or most likely had caused, a reduction of about 60% the number of feral cats in that environment. So the fires are knocking off some of the problems. The trouble is, if you're knocking off 60% of the cats and also 60% of the native wildlife as well, then the per capita impact of those threats remain the same or are increasing because the surviving wildlife species take more risks in a largely burnt landscape. Next. And of course, we know that the fires not only had direct impacts on nature, but those impacts on nature also affected us. So many communities, many people work in the bush, many ecologists I know, many of the people that manage country were severely traumatized by these fires, and much of that trauma, I think, remains. We have been scarred, I think, by these events and will continue to be scarred. To an extent, that scarring has been, now what's the word? There has been some healing through us being willing to contribute to the repair of nature and to see that repair having effect as well. So although we were deeply affected by these fires, I think there has been also some springs of hope that by contributing to the resurrection of this landscape and seeing that recovery, it has been good as well. Thank you, Rachel. So that's a quick run through some of the impacts. I'll try to give an idea now of some of the lessons that we probably learnt, and I've divided it up into, unsurprisingly, into 3 time components: what we should do or was done before the fires, what was done during the fires, and what needs to be done following fires. And again, I'll repeat that I'm using the 2019-20 fires as an example, but I think much of this applies to any emergency or environmental catastrophe as well. So one important component, I'll work through these in some detail. One important component of trying to minimize or reduce the losses in the fires was to have a clear idea before the fires occur of where in the landscape the important components of nature are, or the important values are in the landscape. If we don't know where those things are and how important they are, then we won't be able to protect them. And especially so if resources are limited and we know where other assets such as buildings are, then it will be inevitable that that infrastructure will be prioritized rather than a vague, we know that there's some important bits of nature somewhere out there. We need to know how to protect those assets during the biodiversity assets during fire, and we do need to know how irreplaceable they are. So if we know that something will recover post-fire, then maybe we shouldn't be trying to protect it so hard during the fire. But if we know that that fire will destroy that natural value or make it or damage it for a really long time, then we should be putting much more effort into trying to protect it from the fires. As I said before, our monitoring of biodiversity in Australia is hopeless. And it's important to have monitoring data because that way we know what the pre-fire populations are, and hence we can actually be as explicit as possible about what the losses, the extent of loss due to the catastrophe. we have to build resilience. It's easy to say, and it's sort of a buzzword, but we do have to try to parameterize it and apply it. So for biodiversity or for any natural values in the landscape, the best way of managing or trying to reduce the likely impacts of fire is to manage all the other threats that also affect those species and environments that we can control more readily than fire. So feral animals, weeds and the like. We should try to spread populations to reduce the risks that any single population being wiped out by a fire will affect the total existence of the species. Next. Much of the response by the relevant authorities to these fires was predicated on and played out through plans that were available or that were published before the fires. And those plans are really instrumental. So it's important that biodiversity is well recognised in those regional fire plans and emergency response plans. It was done well in some states, but I think less well in others. So if there are components of the landscape that you think need protection, then you've got to ensure that that recognition of the importance of those sites is explicitly labelled in appropriate regional fire plans or other planning instruments. So the criticality of that is these plans should explain exactly who does what in fires. There's a clear accountability, a clear line of responsibility. And if there's not that, then urgent responses become chaotic. We do need to, the human population in Australia is expanding increasingly into the retreating nature. And we do have to, I think, be clearer that that's an invitation to a catastrophe. And we do have to recognise that there are places that we shouldn't encourage people to live in, or we should simply say that they're no-go areas. We should also ensure that buildings and other infrastructure that are put into these landscapes are as fireproof as possible. So the risks are made as bearable as possible. Recovery plans, as you're probably aware, the Commonwealth government's the previous Commonwealth government was dismissive of recovery plans and didn't do many of them. And I think recovery plans are important to threatened species, especially if they can preempt how to deal with fires and what to do immediately after fires to help retain those populations in the landscape. Hoary chestnut, I think that's a fairly dumb expression. I won't use that one. There were inquiries and royal commissions after the fire. The Commonwealth Royal Commission said that it has always been thus, that the fire authorities protect human life first, and then infrastructure, property, and then nature. And they said this was inflexible. It should always be so. The New South Wales inquiry was much more nuanced and said that there are occasions when protection of biodiversity is more important than protection of infrastructure, which can be repaired and rebuilt, whereas biodiversity often cannot be recovered. So that argument, I think, is still playing out. And I think it's important that we actually get a better aware of community understanding and social license about this hierarchy of should we always protect human life before we protect buildings and sheds. And then after that, if we have the luxury of time and resources, then we can worry about protecting biodiversity. I think it's an important argument, and we haven't heard the last of it yet. Next. There's a lot of capacity building that needs to be done to ensure that the resources are available, experts, well informed, and on hand during any emergency. So that's training of personnel, equipment, certification, shelters, resources, and the like. And that's, governments tend not to resource things unless they're urgent and in their face, but future planning is really critical, I think, in being able to deal with our ability to respond to emergencies into the future. There has to be much more application and testing of Indigenous fire management. After 200 years of European-centric management of fires in Australia, it's clear that it's not working. And we do have to actually learn from those people who were expert in the use of fire in our landscape. We do need to invest into the future to have funds readily available to tap into when emergencies occur. Thanks, Rachel. During fires, it's critical as well. We can stuff things up, or we can save things in the heat of the moment. So for biodiversity, I think it was really important that those with expertise in biodiversity were actually embedded within the control centres and given due authority, so that there was a clear explanation of what the biodiversity values were and why they needed to be protected. And they were on the table in the arguments about how to allocate resources. Also on the ground fighting the fires, it's important that there's biodiversity expertise amongst those in the operational centres. And to be clear also about some of the potential hazards of using some fire control methodologies, such as use of retardants and their likely impacts on aquatic systems. Next. The fire was an extraordinary event in Australia, but I think the response by Australian governments, by state and territory governments, by regional groups, including obviously groups such as the NRMs, by landholders, by Indigenous groups, by philanthropists, and by the community in general was extraordinary. So whereas the impacts and consequences were really severe, really heartening was the response that was made by all sections of government. So one of the important components of that was that there was ready access to a large amount of emergency funding. And it did my heart good to know that more than half of Australians contributed money to the fire recovery effort. I think that's extraordinary. The Australian government and all other governments also had a rapid evidence-based response. So they collated a series of experts, or workshops with experts, who figured out what the priorities were, what the components of our landscape that were most affected by the fire were, what needed to be done to help protect those, and who needed to do those things as well. And that was done in a really rapid time frame. And I think it was done really, really adroitly. So the question was, you know, in the fog of war, what do you prioritise? And if you've got enough experts in the room, enough people with knowledge of country, then you can actually answer that really difficult question. Next. I've worked in governments and out of governments for far too long, 40 or 50 years now, I think. And I've never seen such a such a finely collaborative response made by all sections of society to a problem. And I was really heartened by that. One of the ways it worked really well was that there was a sense of national leadership, but that national leadership from above was met carefully and snugly with on-ground knowledge and inputs from local and regional groups as well. So that's generally the Commonwealth Government gave broad lines of these are the things that need protection, these are the types of management responses that need to be made, and the local and regional groups could meet those priorities and provide the local expertise. And I think it worked really effectively. Next, thanks, Rachel. There was really, I think, good communication about what needed to be done, and recognition that this wasn't a problem that was the responsibility solely of government, that all Australians, all landholders, all communities needed to actually be involved in the solution, because it was a problem that affected us all. And it catalysed, I think, a strong sense that I hadn't felt before in Australia anyway of, you know, what do we really want our future to look like? this was a dystopia, and the dystopia would continue unless we changed the way we live in this country. So I think it was an important landmark in the way we do live in this country and what we care about, what we want to leave our descendants. Next, thanks, Rachel. A whole lot of things were undertaken, a whole lot of activities, and many of these had profound benefits to biodiversity, and much biodiversity would never recover were it not for the actions that many groups made in terms of managing weeds, in controlling cats, deer, foxes, and the like, in gathering material in terms of seeds, or particularly, I think there's a really good example in Victoria where a small cohort of experts employed by the state government went out and collected the last vestiges of populations of freshwater fish and crayfish before the sedimentation which occurred after the fires reached those streams, and and then they took those fish that they'd rescued into special captivity holding facilities and managed to keep them in there until the streams cleared up again. And those actions, I think, clearly prevented extinctions which would otherwise have occurred. Nest boxes were used in many areas, I think, successfully. I'm not sure about the provision of food. I don't think the evidence is really good for dropping carrots on rock wallabies and the like. I think I'm not sure that that was successful. There was a lot of survey and monitoring, and the establishment of monitoring, and the monitoring again was really important so that we can actually figure out exactly what was lost or the quantity of that loss. We can measure the effectiveness of all of these actions that were taken and then hone them based on that monitoring to it's an adaptive management thing. And we can report on that recovery, and all of the money that was invested by the Commonwealth Government in these post-fire recovery efforts comes with the expectation and obligation to report how successful that has been. Thanks, Rachel. An important also post-fire component was making sure that those most fire-affected species were subsequently listed formally as threatened, and that's been ongoing for the last year or so, because that does give some protection and some ongoing prioritisation of the conservation for those species. And many of the plans that may have worked in fires that were of the traditional type and intensity were found to fail in these fires. The fires simply overcame the planning. So there's been an urgent need to recalibrate and renew many of those plans to actually make them more effective into the future. Thanks, Rachel. This is my last one, just recognition that, for example, that almost all of the $200 million invested by the Australian government in the fire recovery programs was for no more than 2 years. But recovery of nature after such a catastrophic event will take much longer, will take decades. And we can't forget that after the heat of the moment has passed, that there is an ongoing need to continue to invest in recovery. And our world's going to be blighted unless the cause of these fires and their intensity was climate change. There's no equivocation about that. And it's the fires of 2019-20 are a harbinger of the future unless we do something about reducing our emissions and constraining global climate change. That's not a miserable outlook on the future, but it's a clear reminder to us all that we've got to do much more in terms of activism, in terms of influencing government and the like. And I guess the election that we've had recently is a merciful reminder that maybe that message is getting through to our community. Thanks.